The conflict in Ukraine is important because Vladimir Putin and the Russian state seeks to recreate pieces of the Russian Empire, of the USSR, and of going back to the ways of the 20th century where powerful countries intimidate their neighbors, invade their neighbors, engage in imperialism and concepts of empire. And it is a threat to the whole world because if Russia wins in Ukraine, the logical next step is why not try for Belarus? Why not try for Poland? If Russia wins in Ukraine, China might choose to make a play for invading India or invading Taiwan. Okay, the entire project of the 20th century has been to achieve a certain kind of peace and liberal democracy and freedom and safety. And that entire project is at question. If Putin gets away with invading Ukraine, there is a lot at stake.
Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Ajay and this is Amit. Fooled you for a moment, didn't we? This is Amit and Ajay, and we're glad to have you here. So, Ajay, I want to kind of tell you this story about a dear friend of mine, Gaurav Chintamani, who edits The Seen and the Unseen, helps us with sound for this show. And recently, I was in Delhi for a bunch of recordings, and he's a big fan of yours. And he started watching Everything is Everything, loves the show. But he had heard your Ukraine episode, and he was completely blown away. You know, the episode you and I did for The Seen and the Unseen, 5.5 hour primer on Ukraine, complete masterpiece. I've heard about it from so many people that how does this guy know so much about Ukraine, right? And Gaurav kind of had the same reaction, completely mind blown. And at one point in the studio, I was saying, कि यार मणिपुर पे episode करना चाहिए. Can you think of an expert I can call? He said, ऐसा क्या है? अजय को ही बुला लो. What is your response to that?
I only know 16 things.
So, today we're going to talk about Ukraine because you pointed out that a lot has happened there since we recorded our episode. So, why not sort of do an update? But I'm not going to assume that everyone who's watching this right now has seen our episode, though I recommend they should. It's more than 5 hours. It's a masterclass in understanding, the history of the conflict, in understanding the deep history of Russia itself, Ukraine itself, and, the nuances of that. But, and I recommend everyone go and watch that. But I want to begin by before we come to the current conflict, I want to quickly go over some of the main areas for those who haven't heard that. And the first question I want to ask you is, why is this important? Russia and Ukraine are far away from where we are in India, or far away from where many of our viewers might be. Why does it matter? It's a war in some other random place. Why should we care?
The great drama of the 20th century involved wars and conflicts and disasters for millions of households all over the world, including in India. The Second World War fundamentally ended with a resolution with the collapse of the USSR. So Nazi Germany collapsed and communist USSR collapsed, and there was a great flowering of freedom and democracy all over the world. And that was the best possible outcome we could have asked for from the 20th century. The conflict in Ukraine is important because Vladimir Putin and the Russian state seeks to recreate pieces of the Russian Empire, of the USSR, and of going back to the ways of the 20th century where powerful countries intimidate their neighbors, invade their neighbors, engage in imperialism and concepts of empire. And it is a threat to the whole world because if Russia wins in Ukraine, the logical next step is why not try for Belarus? Why not try for Poland? If Russia wins in Ukraine, China might choose to make a play for invading India or invading Taiwan. Okay, the entire project of the 20th century has been to achieve a certain kind of peace and liberal democracy and freedom and safety. And that entire project is at question. If Putin gets away with invading Ukraine, there is a lot at stake.
What is happening today reminds me of the famous Thomas Jefferson quote about how liberty requires eternal vigilance. You can't take it for granted. You have to fight for it. And, that sense of false hope and optimism that came when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, when Francis Fukuyama famously wrote his essay about the end of history, question mark. And one assumed that the arc of history was going in a certain direction, and that direction many felt was okay, liberal democracy. We've solved all those big ideological questions. We know this is a way forward, the way to prosperity. And it almost seems in the last few years that things are kind of falling apart, and therefore that makes it important.
And again, that triply amplifies the Ukraine problem. So imagine if there was no Trump, no Xi Jinping, no Putin, no Erdogan. Okay, if right-wing nationalism was not back as a force all over the world, then the Ukraine war would have had a lower materiality. But that's not the world we live in. We're actually in a world where political systems the world over are a threat from a new kind of authoritarianism. And partly it's a message to everybody that, liberal democracy is a fragile compact, and we need to renew our vows every day, but also that there is an international dimension to this. So just as Mussolini and Hitler and Imperial Japan worked together, like that, the right-wing authoritarians of the world have ways of propping up each other and supporting each other. So uh, you remember the phrase that I had used in our podcast conversation going upstream from Hemingway, for whom the bell tolls. Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. We cannot ignore a remote conflict in Spain in 1936. We cannot ignore a conflict in Ukraine in 2022, 2023.
I have a question leading on from here, which is that there's sort of a broader reason, a broader philosophical reason for fighting this fight and being on Ukraine's side, and that is a fight for liberal democracy and the values we care about of freedom and liberty and so on. And there is also the proximate foreign policy matter that if you allow this to stand, China will feel emboldened to attack Taiwan or take Arunachal. And like you said, Putin could be, if he wins this, could be further emboldened to go deeper, go to Belarus and whatever. And these are two simultaneous reasons. But what often happens is that countries have different incentives, politicians have different incentives across the world. It is not necessary that that larger battle for liberal democracy is something that will necessarily concern, say, someone in the US, because they can take it for granted. They're like, we are okay. They're like, why get embroiled in another messy war after Iraq and Afghanistan? And that could be one strain of thinking. Equally, there could be incentives that take you in the other direction. For example, one common thinking, and no doubt Russia's assumption before this war, is that Europe is dependent on our oil, because Europe at one point, a lot of Europe made the disastrous decision, and something I discussed in an episode right when the war started with Pranay Kotasane and Nitin Pai, that'll be linked from the show notes as well. Europe made the disastrous decision that we'll have pipelines from Russia giving us oil rather than kind of build ports and open yourself up to supply from elsewhere, right? And they made that choice, and Russia assumed that they're dependent on us. We can shut them down. Germany's towns can go without light and warming, especially, which would be a disaster, especially in winter. And that was the assumption. So part of it, part of the Russian assumption was that fine, these imperatives that you described exist, but the West won't do anything. But the West did. And I want you to tell me a little bit about that. What did they do? Why did they do it?
We have to see Putin's strategy in a little bit of historical context. On the 8th of August 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and basically nobody helped Georgia. In February 2014, Putin invaded Crimea, grabbed Crimea from Ukraine, and nobody did anything. And so he started getting comfortable that the West does not have a stomach for a fight. But in the event, it actually proved to be a bit like Hitler and Czechoslovakia and Austria and then Poland. That on the 1st of September 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, uh, England and France said, enough is enough. We declare World War II today. And they gave him an ultimatum. Today, you have to withdraw your forces from Poland. Otherwise, there'll be a declaration of war in the evening. So I think something similar happened, that there were many apologists for Russia all over the world. And even today, there are, who want to tell some kind soft story that, oh, but Russia has some legitimate security interests and so on. But in my mind, there's a simple line, which is you don't invade your neighbors. It's just that's it. It's black and white. It's simple. You don't invade your neighbors. Uh, Saying that Putin has a right to invade Ukraine because Ukraine desires certain treaties is as preposterous as saying that India has a right to invade Bangladesh when Bangladesh tries to sign on to certain treaties. That is a nonsensical position and nobody should accept it. There is such a thing as a sovereign nation, and the whole point of the 20th century was to put an end to this kind of imperialistic nonsense where India gets to instruct Bangladesh on how it will behave in its foreign policy. That age is over, it's gone, and we should never accept that again. And so when Putin invaded Ukraine, actually, they had not done the full military planning for an invasion. They had thought that we'll put up some show of force and the West will buckle. And if the West does not support Ukraine, then the Ukrainian army will also flee. It will be more like Afghanistan, where the Taliban completely won the entire Afghanistan war because the moment the Americans left, there was no stomach for a fight. That's what was their intelligence assessment. And in the event, every bit of this proved to be wrong. For one, the Ukrainians stood and fought. Okay, so there is a priceless moment in that war where the Americans offered Zelensky a flight out of Kiev, exactly what they did in Afghanistan. And Zelensky said, I don't want a ride, I want ammunition. Okay, that's just one of the most priceless moments in world history where he said, no, this is my country, I will stand and fight. And everything started changing around that because then he started rallying his people. And then the West started turning around and saying, no, I will support this. And then this brings me to the energy story. Putin and many others thought that with the Western energy dependence, with the European energy dependence upon Russian oil and gas, when Putin will engage in energy blackmail, that will trigger off a great recession in Europe. And then there will be a great rise of, working class anger, which will feed into communism and Nazism. Okay, we've seen that movie 100 years ago. And it will actually destroy the democratic middle, that the two extremes of the right wing authoritarian, the Nazis, and the left wing, the communists, will become emboldened and under proportional representation, which is there in many of the European countries, you will destroy the fragile coalitions of the middle, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats. This is the middle. So, in a way, it opens up a story of the 20th century all over again, that the center does not hold and the crazies on the left and the right become powerful. So that's what a huge steep recession is supposed to do. And what in fact happened was out of the world. I think many people underestimate the intellectual, the cultural, the technological, the financial might of the advanced economies of the world. Okay, many people in the advanced economies are mild and self-effacing and humble, and from a distance, it is easy to underestimate their capabilities. What was done in Europe was out of the world. There are going to be books and books written about how Europe fought that energy blackmail of 2022. But in short, they did. They tripled their work on renewables. They imported LNG from all over the world. Before the war, people believed that it takes 2 to 3 years to build an LNG terminal. They got LNG terminals done in 6 months. They created subsidy programs to protect poor people from the giant rise in gas prices. So the people did not freeze to death in winter. And by and large, the European economies sailed through 2022 with difficulty, but not with the kind of crisis that Putin had hoped for. And then once you call that bluff, it is actually a strategic disaster for the USSR, for Russia. Because now Russia has lost their only buyer. Where are you going to be able to build pipelines to carry gas to sell that gas? So that entire economic foundation of the Russian economy was shattered because selling gas cheaply to Europe was the whole idea around which the Russian economy was built.
Before my next question, I just want to point out to all our listeners something that both you and I feel deeply about, which is that it's important to separate Russia from the Russian people, right? The Russian people have protested heroically at this. I follow chess really closely. Some 40 chess grandmasters, their top players basically, besides one coward called Sergei Karyakin, who is sort of a Putin Bhakt, but all of their top grandmasters, besides one guy, wrote a letter protesting against this. Many of them had to move out of the country. Some of them are now, playing for other chess federations in tournaments around the world. All of them protested. We've seen this from artists and thinkers across the world. We've had, great intellectuals like Gary Kasparov for years protesting against Putin, giving us a warning that this is exactly what would happen, and, fighting against the apologists. And again, that episode that we did is, I think an essential counter to a lot of the propaganda that Russia spreads, because the propaganda machine is mind-blowing, and we discussed the propaganda machine in the episode as well. My next question is this. I came across...
An astonishing feat of Russian propaganda is Indian video outlets such as Hindustan Times on YouTube. It's amazing how they're swallowing Russian propaganda. So they're really getting through everywhere in the world. I also was not understanding Putin. I was just thinking, one more Russian strongman. Gary Kasparov was a key for me to wake up that no, this is different, that you're going back to a different level of authoritarian and yearning for the USSR. And finally, it's always important for us to establish some of these clean separations, that it's always important to separate the state from the people, that there is a difference between the Bangladeshi state and the Bangladeshi people. And it is perfectly possible for the Bangladeshi people to be in a very different place, and for actions of the state to not even represent the best interests of the Bangladeshi state. So very often these things get conflated, and particularly when you come to war, it is so easy to have a rally around the flag. So one good friend of ours said to me about a Russian analyst that when Putin invaded Russia, that person felt that I have to stand with my country. And that's a simple, basic intellectual blunder, that when the state invades some other country, your patriotism doesn't mean that you have to stand with your government.
In fact, if our country does something wrong, or if our government does something wrong, it is a sign of your patriotism that you protest for the sake of what your country means to you. Yeah, and you mentioned what a particular media outlet does, where they just follow Russian propaganda. And I think part of the reason for that, and it's very sad and it's something that people need to think about in media more, is that we have lost that distinction between journalism and content. Journalism has certain values. It's a pursuit of truth. There's a certain rigor to what you put out there, etc., right? But media companies today are no longer really doing journalism per se, but they're in a content game, and it's a question of keep putting content out, and keep giving quote unquote insight, whether it is accurate or not. And the danger of that game is that then the best propaganda machines win, that it becomes a battle of it becomes about narrative and not truth, and that becomes problematic. What I want to talk about now is, for the perhaps the only part of the show, I want to kind of personalize it and talk about a person. Now, I was reading this great interview of Michael Kaufman, and Kaufman in that interview said something that you and I would have agreed with weeks ago, and you and I would have thought that we would have said that the Russian invasion is probably going to succeed and the occupation is going to fail. And the reason for why the occupation is going to fail is something we discussed in an earlier Everything is Everything episode, where we spoke about guerrilla warfare and so on at length. There is no way that any Russian occupation could have worked. What took us by surprise, what took almost everybody by surprise, perhaps even Ukraine itself, is that the invasion itself failed. And the invasion failed partly because the Russians assumed that it's going to be easy, that we're just going to march in there and, they'll welcome us with open arms. They had this clumsy operation where they landed at the airport at Kiev. There were like different groups sent to assassinate Zelensky, and Thankfully, they failed. And, in the first 24 hours were key, but they did not succeed. The invasion failed. And when I look back, part of this is perhaps because, a big army, like a big company, can often be ossified in certain ways, can make fallacious assumptions, and there can be, a slow flow of information from bottom to top. But also, it has to do, I think, with the individual megalomania of the man on top, which in this case is Putin. He's 70 years old. He hankers for, not just the Soviet Union, but the imperial past of Russia. He sees it as a great nation. He is perhaps blinded by ego, and what typically tends to happen to authoritarian leaders everywhere is that they get surrounded by yes men, and no one dares to contradict them in any way, and therefore their finest minds, eventually disappear into the shadows or in exile, and they're surrounded by yes men, and delusions can then persist. So tell me a little bit about Vladimir Putin, and your sense of how critical it is to sort of understand him, because on the one hand, foreign powers and foreign policy people will often behave as if people are rational actors, but this is a 70-year-old man with an imperialist delusion, and time is running out for him because he is 70. How much can we take his rationality for granted? In fact, this would have been one factor in his favor, because you could have assumed that the West would have feared nuclear escalation and they would have, stayed away from him. But something else entirely is working out. So, what's your sense?
Putin is a KGB person, brought up in the dark arts with a certain suspicious nationalism as his thing. He has openly said that the collapse of the USSR was a great geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And in that, he's exactly the opposite of what you or I or, most thinking people in the world would think. That I would view the collapse of the USSR as one of the most glorious moments of the 20th century, on a par with the end of the Nazi regime in Germany of 1945. For me, these are the two great humanizing milestones of the 20th century. And instead, Putin sees that as a catastrophe of the highest order, and he seeks to recreate that. So bit by bit, he's gone after that project of recreating the concentrated power and cruelty and violence of the USSR, and creeping into the territory and the imperial control of peoples that wish to be free. So the Georgians want their own country, the Ukrainians want their own country, the Poles want their own country, the Baltic states want their own countries. And Putin would like to go step by step, establishing dominion in various shades of grey. In the case of Georgia, it's a little bit of land has been grabbed through an invasion. Then standard Hitler, Stalin playbook, some nonsense fake republics are created. The Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic, the DPR, LPR, some fake countries are created. Nobody in the world recognizes them. And then Russia starts giving military aid to the fake country. And actually, it's the Russian army fighting in disguise in a war that has been created, but it is claimed is a Ukrainian civil war. Similarly, for all practical purposes, Putin has political control in Belarus, to the point where the Russian army invaded Ukraine through the Ukraine-Belarus border. And so on it goes. So Putin is in a journey of trying to recreate an empire. There is a phrase for it. It's called civilizational state. Okay, the civilizational state is a truly dangerous concept. It is tantamount to the rejection of the basic concepts and discipline of a national border. That there is a border between India and Bangladesh. There is a border between China and India, and these borders are inviolable. Whereas a civilizational state does not accept those restrictions, and it will start claiming that Chinese people in Malaysia are being oppressed, so let's invade Malaysia because we want to help the Chinese people in Malaysia, and so on.
In our episode, we spoke about the changing incentives, and as a card-carrying economist, you're looking at incentives all the time. And I love that old story of I love that old riddle about when it comes to bacon and eggs, what is the difference between the chicken and the pig? And the difference is that the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And in a sense, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the incentives are different. Russia, in a sense, is fighting for ego or some sense of grandeur, or in the case of its entire army, for the delusions of one megalomaniac at the top. But Ukraine is fighting for its existence. So the incentives are crazy. They will fight harder, they will run harder, they will hit harder, they will do all of that. So on the one hand, there are the incentives in the way they are, and also what I was really struck by is then the response in the difference between sort of the militaries. Like one of the great learnings from the episode we did together was about the bottom-up innovation showed by Ukraine, where a military machine is typically a top-down machine, and a big machine like Russia can get ossified and not work smoothly. But the Ukraine machine, in that emergent moment of necessity, there were such acts of innovation, like an Uber for sort of artillery, as you pointed out. So tell me a little bit more about that, because that's so fascinating to me that you can have that happen.
While in the story of the bacon and the eggs, uh, the pig is running for his life, it is also true that countries have been invaded before and lost. So you may fight as desperately as you can, but there are no guarantees. Czechoslovakia was overrun by the Germans, Austria was overrun by the Germans, okay, and so on. So things can go wrong, there are no certainties. But yes, that morale, that zeal, that fighting for your homeland is an immense edge. In military affairs, sometimes we say that war is about money, men, material, and morale. And that morale is an inestimable that just changes the entire landscape. In thinking about government and public policy and public administration, which is actually the lens through which I look at all this, I find it useful to think at three levels. Okay, so the lowest level is problems where you can have extreme transparency and extreme checks and balances. Okay, so a government works best when there is full transparency and full criticism. So imagine everybody attacks the Bank of England every day, and the Bank of England has no secrets. Okay, that's where the Bank of England will work well, because you'll hire some blokes. Okay, the quality of people that go into government is always a little weak, but all the best intellectual firepower in the country is there every day, sniping at those people, criticizing them, finding their mistakes, and those bugs get solved. Okay, so that's one level, that the basics of liberal democracy and the governance package about how you get to an advanced economic configuration is that you hire some kind of people into government. Government will not get the best people, their organization structure will be pretty bad, but we open it up with transparency, and hopefully there is enough freedom in the country and philanthropic capital in the country that there are many intellectuals outside government who will basically fix up the work. That the intellectuals will attack the government, will criticize the government, they will report the bugs, and they'll report the solutions. And that's how things get fixed. So you don't need the best people in the country, and you don't need the best capabilities in the country in the government, but you do need liberal democracy, you need freedom of speech, and you need the intellectuals standing outside who are endlessly watching those poor blokes in government and telling them, hey, you made this mistake, hey, you made this mistake. Okay, that's how things get fixed. That's like a level one problem. Now you come to militaries. In militaries, there's a lot of secrecy. It's difficult to rip it open and have that openness, that transparency. By default, you say soldier, soldier. You say my country is in a war, and then you can't criticize that country. So everything is harder around the military. That in the best of countries, more mistakes are made in military affairs than in monetary policy, because of that level of secrecy and because of that patriotism that interferes with the ability and the confidence of some people to criticize their own country. Okay, and again, the best countries do that. The greatness of the United States is that the best and the brightest of the United States criticized the United States government in the Vietnam War, criticized the United States government in the Afghanistan war, criticized the United States government in the Iraq war, and so on. Okay, that is a well-functioning country, because militaries make mistakes. Okay, so that's level two, where you are a liberal democracy and you have great intellectuals outside who are able to outthink the people inside the military, who criticize it to death, who run protests on the street saying, bring the boys back home. Okay, where there are powerful anti-war movements and there are intellectuals, and the intellectuals win the argument, and then wars end because the leadership is forced to admit in the domestic political conflict on the floor of the legislature that we are wrong, we made a mistake, and we have to get out of this war. Okay, so that is a liberal democracy, but a military problem. It's harder than a liberal democracy and civil matters. Civil matters are the easiest, because you just prize it open and people have no qualms criticizing your own government on civilian matters. Military matters are harder. Now you come to the worst of all, which is an authoritarian country, often fueled by nationalism, doing military affairs. This is the worst. Because first of all, you're authoritarian, so you've started crushing the intellectuals, you have started reducing freedom of speech, people are scared to speak up, people are not criticizing the government. Second of all, it's military affairs. Now you start getting to patriotism and, oh, how can I criticize my own country, I have to stand with my country. Those kinds of things start coming up, and so the supply of criticism goes down. The supply of brain power in the country who are thinking, analyzing military affairs is low. Militaries in authoritarian countries are more transparent, are more non-transparent. In the United States, you will get the precise fiscal data for how many artillery shells were produced in which year, for how many javelin anti-tank guided missiles were purchased in which year. In the Indian budget, you get nothing. There's no transparency. So, I mean, I am a person that counts myself as curious about Indian military affairs, but when I land up on the websites, basically there is nothing. There are no holds to climb the wall because you just don't know what is going on. The level of disclosure, the level of conversation is so poor that you don't know. It is easy for a person like me to access information about Japanese military affairs, but not about Indian military affairs. Okay, and then the worst of all is Putin, Russia, or China military. This is complete secrecy, complete fear. So you have no information coming out, and the intellectuals have been silenced. The intellectuals maybe don't even exist, and there is no information coming out. So what research will you do? What criticism will you make? So then these organizations are just out of control. They're worse than corporations because there is no market test. So it's ironical that in a certain weak political intuition of the Indian middle class, we respect strong men, and we think, authoritarian countries have a strong military, have a capable military. They can just go invade anybody. They can accept unbelievable levels of deaths of their own people, and we think that gives strength. In fact, that gives weakness. That is sophisticated political thinking. To understand a state is to understand that authoritarian countries make the worst militaries.
And I just want to sort of zoom in onto one point there. That when you said that I'll go to the website and I won't find this information. I want this information. Our gentle readers might think, why does it matter? What's the big deal? But it matters because transparency indicates accountability. Accountability indicates efficiency. You do your job well when there are always been questions asked from above and below, and and that's a classic thing. And Ukraine, of course, was in this messy situation where you are fighting for your life. You'll do whatever it takes, and the ingenuity is coming from everywhere. And then there is hierarchies and egos and all of that don't kick in, which is kind of inspiring. Before we get to the the current developments, as it were, I a final point I want to sort of talk about, because it intrigues me a lot, is the changing nature of modern warfare. Like, there was a time where you would, when tanks were first introduced, they were a mind-blowing innovation. They changed everything. Today, if a tank is deployed somewhere in the battlefield, within 10 minutes is the time that it can be detected and destroyed by a drone. Ukraine, as you pointed out in that episode, is using about 10,000 drones a month. And these are kind of old estimates. It might even be more now. And ironically, a lot of them are cheap Chinese made drones. And essentially, now what happens is that you don't even have to be at the front. You can be well inside the front somewhere, and a drone can come and see you in a trench and drop a grenade. Or a drone armed with explosives can, be remote flown into whatever your target is. So what happens is that a battlefield becomes totally visible in real time, right? And drones give you that visibility. Drones also give you the penetration. It kind of changes the nature of modern warfare in a sense, to the point where one day in the distant future there may even be no soldiers. It could all be automated, and we could sit at home and watch it on TV. But what is give me a sense of.
My personal sense of organizing all this evolution through the history is I kind of run in four phases. The first is Napoleonic warfare, is the first modern organization of people and guns and cavalry and artillery and so on. And there was incremental evolution with that all the way till the First World War, over a 100-year period. At the beginning of the First World War, it rapidly collapsed into a siege stalemate, and we'll talk a lot more about stalemate. And late in the First World War, there were dramatic innovations that took place. Modern so-called combined arms warfare doctrine came together, where the infantry and the artillery and the tanks all started working together in a synchronized way. And the magic is that the response of the enemy to the tanks uncovers difficulties that the infantry will exploit, that the artillery will exploit, and so on. Each of these is a self reinforcing thing, and that's called combined arms warfare. Combined arms warfare is the modern configuration, is the modern system of cover, concealment, coordination between many, many different systems. That's like the end of the First World War. Then through the interwar period, there were great developments around understanding tanks and aircraft and integrating these into military doctrine. Marshal Tukhachevsky in the Soviet Union and then the great thinkers of Nazi Germany figured out all this stuff, and that gives us the main material of the Second World War. Then there was a long detour around nuclear questions, and for some time it was thought that conventional warfare is obsolete. And while nuclear strategy is an interesting and separate question, it stands aloof from the main track of conventional warfare. In conventional warfare, by the 80s and 90s, people were talking of double quotes, a revolution in military affairs, RMA, and many old timers became a little irritated and jaded around this phrase, revolution of military affairs, implying that this is overstated and, surely you guys are just being too rah-rah about certain incipient developments. In the Ukraine war, for the first time, we see the RMA playing out fully. And it really boils down to two things. One, amazing levels of battlefield transparency, that whether through drones or through satellite imagery or through a variety of electronic monitoring, the level of detail of what we know about the modern battlefield is just out of this world. Never before in world history have we known so much. And the second is precision guided munitions. During World War II, if you sent a bomb down from a plane, half the bombs exploded more than 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers away from the target. Note, 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers away from the target. You had to throw thousands of bombs to hit one factory. Okay, that was the inefficiency.
So if someone tries to bomb me in Andheri, they'll get you in Bandra.
Correct. Okay, that was World War II levels of precision. And what has changed today is precision guided munitions, that a variety of weapons have come together where circular error probabilities of 10 meters, 20 meters have become increasingly commonplace. That hitting to 1 meter is hard, but hitting to 20 meters is now increasingly mainstream for many, many weapon systems. And that changes everything. So now I have good intelligence about where the bloke is, and I'm able to deliver one precise kill at that location and not a whole lot of wastage of ammunition and not a whole lot of collateral damage. This has one very important consequence, that how do you wage war? World War II doctrine was supposed to be that in secret, you assemble force, you concentrate force, and you score a breakthrough. So the enemy gets surprised when I'm an invader. Because I'm an invader, I have the initiative, the chess term initiative. When I have the initiative, I surprise the enemy. There's limited forces there. And I have overwhelming force that I prepared on my side of the front. And with that overwhelming force advantage, I break through the line, and my early troops can get mauled, but I've planned all this ahead of time. So I've got fresh troops behind. Once a breakthrough has been scored, my fresh troops behind, mechanized, armored troops, fly through the breach and run havoc behind the enemy, doing what the Soviets called deep operations, where you go deep into the rear and go after logistics and command and control. So you go after ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, storage mechanisms, transportation mechanisms, trucks, and command and control centers. So you just go for 10 square kilometers, 50 square kilometers, 100 square kilometers, creating chaos. And the enemy forces just get confused and they go off into a pell-mell riot. And the worst way to retreat is what is not a fighting retreat, but just running. And at that point, you can inflict tremendous damage on the enemy. This was World War II doctrine. None of that readily works today, because when you try to accumulate force, the other side will generally see you. It's hard to accumulate force. Even Russia has half decent spy satellites by which they're able to get some imagery. On the Ukrainian side, there is unimaginably great surveillance capabilities from the air by NATO spy satellites. So when force is accumulated, imagine very modest levels of force of 100 armored fighting vehicles and 1,000 troops. Not a lot. I'm not talking division strength. I'm not talking 10,000 people. I'm only talking 1,000 people. Not a whole lot of strength by World War II standards. But think of the footprint that 100 armored fighting vehicles and 1,000 people would leave in the eyes of a satellite. And all you need is 10 artillery shells with cluster munition to make a very bad day for that force. So you just can't accumulate force anymore. And then how do you score a breakthrough?
Marvelous. Lawrence Friedman in a great piece sums up American doctrine towards war thus, where he writes, a main effort to ensure that maximum resources go to a single front, even if supported forces are fighting in other areas to hedge against failure or spread out enemy defenses. And James Conroy, who's written books about World War II and so on, and his take on this was that the Americans got this strategy from Ulysses S. Grant, the 19th century general, and he writes, quote, they built a powerful army when the need arose, attacked the enemy's strength as quickly as possible, and took and inflicted casualties until he stopped struggling. Anything less was a distraction, stop quote. And this seems to make sense. If you are the bigger player, you make a show of force and you just burst through and then you finish the matter right there, just as you described. And the Americans and the West, of course, has been, helping Ukraine with sort of ammo and know-how and so on and so forth. And their expectation before the counteroffensive this year was that's what Ukraine would do, that there would be an overwhelming breakthrough, and after that there would be, that whatever happened would happen quickly in that way. And there was disappointment in American circles, and this has been like very voluble and widespread disappointment from many analysts that this didn't happen, and they were like, "Shit, we are arming these guys, and they're not, winning the game. They're not fighting the battle properly. Except that they are expecting Ukraine to fight war the way they've always fought it, but it's a different territory, it's a different terrain, it's a different enemy, and as you described, the nature of warfare itself has changed."
And that is the great question of the age, is, one of the most important questions of 2023. The fate of the world is on the line on deeply understanding that question. Before we go into that, shall we just show a map? Okay, let me talk through the map. Okay, so what you see is this entire swathe of land that has been grabbed by Russia. Let me start at the bottom. There's the Crimean Peninsula jutting out into the Black Sea, an immense promontory using which you can project naval force into the Black Sea, which was grabbed by Russia in 2014. I want you to note closely that it has only one connection to Russia, and that is a bridge that was built after the 2014 invasion. In, I think, 2018, the bridge was commissioned. That's called the Kerch Bridge. If you take away the Kerch Bridge, actually, Crimea has no land connectivity to Russia. Okay, so in a way, it is untenable for Russia because it is actually quite feasible for Ukraine to destroy the Kerch Bridge. Okay, let's go above Crimea, and you get the region in proximity to Kherson, and right adjoining to that is the province of Zaporizhia. Okay, these parts are invaded territory of Ukraine where the entire supply and sustainment is coming out of Crimea. So again, you see the deep interconnections. If Crimea falls, you can't support the war in those northern provinces because it's very difficult to do the logistics all the way from the other side. So Crimea holds the key. If you break the Kerch Bridge, if you break the logistics process of moving goods up from Crimea up into Kherson and Zaporizhia, then the war in Kherson and Zaporizhia is lost. So that entire south is up for the take. Okay? Now there is a long path. You can start from the Russian border, from Rostov-on-Don, and move materials through the Donbas province and then into Zaporizhia. Okay, and above that, there is the Kharkiv province. Now you have to think, where would Ukraine choose to attack and how? Would you attack in Kharkiv? The problem is, it's right next to the Russian border, so they'll be able to resupply there. Would you attack in Donbas? It's a problem because there are many cities, and cities actually are great defensive fortresses. Okay, ever since the Second World War, we have known that a Stalingrad can be defended. Cities are just natural cover and concealment, so it's very difficult to conquer a city. So it's hard to do the Donbass because it's a more industrialized area with urban congregations. And then you get to Zaporizhia, the dream of every armchair military strategist became that imagine you do one great armored thrust down from Ukraine to the Sea of Azov. It's a distance of about 60-65 kilometers. That's all. And if you can pull off that thrust, then suddenly you have cut off the entire Russian forces to the west and the south. Because presumably Ukraine has the capability to kill the Kerch Bridge at will. Okay, so they haven't done it, but basically everybody knows that it's a decision to make. That when required, Ukraine will have the brain power and the military might to destroy the Kerch Bridge. So imagine these two coming together: that an armored thrust down to reach the Sea of Azov, and you kill the Kerch Bridge. Suddenly, Kherson and Zaporizhia and Crimea is up for grabs, and Ukraine gets back a whole chunk of that. And then you're left with a long, difficult conflict around Donbass and Kharkiv. Okay, so this was the great plan, unfortunately dreamt up in public domain by every armchair military strategist in the whole world. I remember thinking that this is so obvious that when I look at the map, it is so obvious that this has to be done. So like, surely you got to do something else, right? I mean, if something is so obvious, you can't be doing that. You got to think of something different.
I want to interrupt with a couple of great quotes about plans. One is by Walt Moltke, where he says, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." And the other one is by Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face.
Yeah. And the plan is useless. The planning is everything. Gentle reader, if ever you think I'm eloquent, I'm actually just a database. I steal stuff. Okay, so some clever person said this. It was not me. That is what all modern militaries are demanded to do. It is to be able to learn, improvise, and adapt under fire. That is state capacity. And once again, the authoritarians fare badly on this because that culture of debate, discussion, criticism, intellectuals, brain power, this is not what armies are in the best of times, and definitely not what armies of authoritarian countries are. When you cloak yourself in nationalism and you get the machismo, that male testosterone view of the world, it's not a thinking way of operating. And this is the weakness of authoritarian countries. So this was the state of play through the winter of 2022. The West was arming Ukraine, and everybody knew that when the summer comes, there will be some counteroffensive, and nobody knew what. Okay, now in this, I want to layer the issue of combined arms warfare. Okay, the Western way of war is combined arms warfare, where all these things should work together. 2 and 2 should become 22. You shouldn't have one tank battle being fought separately and one infantry battle being fought separately. They should work together. They should work in harmony. The trouble is, it takes tremendous levels of training. It takes tremendous levels of competence. I want to say this in two different ways. The first is, imagine we are 10 people in one small organization, and we learn to work together. We learn to organize ourselves. If 1,000 people want to learn to work together, want to learn to organize themselves, it's much harder. So the bigger the organization, the greater the management challenge. And one standard idea in the world of business is that every 2x the size of a firm in terms of headcount, you need to pretty fundamentally change the organization design, the process manual. So roughly a doubling of the headcount is generally considered enough cause to pretty completely rethink the nature of the organization. So now think, we're doing combined arms warfare at the level of a 100-person group. Inside that 100-person group, we have many, many kinds of equipment. We've got simple, infantry with guns. We've got people operating drones. We've got people operating electronic warfare. We've got some artillery. We've got some tanks. We've got some other infantry fighting vehicles. Okay, we've got a bunch of other things. So already I have layered on incredible levels of engineering and scientific complexity on a mere 100 blokes. Now, those 100 blokes are not superhuman. They're just regular guys. They're like you and me. Okay. If it's a Ukrainian army, it's literally guys like you and me. It is literally people like you and me in Ukraine who have volunteered to go fight this war. Then they have all the human frailties just like you and me. We are all subject to our petty ego and our arrogance and our anger and our little temper and our pride in what we know and a disrespect for what other people know. So the drone guy says to the EW guy, the electronic warfare guy, that, manning a drone is the greatest skill in the world. And the EW guy says, yeah, you guys, you just fly these birds. We shoot them down. Okay. And so on. So there's all this pettiness. Imagine bringing them together, melding them, not just in processes, but in emotions, not just in camaraderie, but in the level of trust where you lay down your life. Let me be completely tangible about it. I'm a tanker, you're the infantry guy outside me. Sometimes I'm going to ask things of you where you will put your life on the line. Sometimes you will ask things of me where I will put my life on the line. Think of the level of connection, knowledge, a long time together where we have been through many battles together so that we reach that evolved level of trust, so that we are fighting like a Capablanca combination. Okay? That doesn't come easily. It takes years of training. It takes enormous knowledge where all these pieces, they understand each other. Then there is a rook sacrifice. And then the rest of the thing dances into place and achieves amazing things. That is very, very, very hard. And with the kind of time available for training for Ukraine, this kind of combined arms capability has not happened above group sizes of about 100. Okay, so if you had spoken to me in the winter, this was a great question. The idea was that there are people in Ukraine who know old Soviet warfare, which is frankly a bit obsolete. The latest and greatest thing in the world is a Western way of war, and it involves doing combined arms at an unbelievable level of grace and speed and a ballet of high capability. They're going to be taught this stuff. How much can they learn? How quickly can they learn? Now we know the answer. They are not able to do combined arms warfare above 100 people. Okay, so this is problem number one, that they have fumbled and failed when larger teams have tried to orchestrate together. There have been crazy phone calls and screaming matches, and people have made mistakes. Like a bunch of tanks went where they were not supposed to go. Things like that. Basic fumbles happened when more complex combined arms operations were attempted. This is part one. It's a brute, cruel fact, and which we all should just recognize that the winter of training with some of the world's best people. Okay, these are the best and brightest from Ukrainian society. These are people with scientific engineering backgrounds. These are people who want to fight for their country. Under these conditions, in a couple of months, you can't turn civilians into combined arms warfare specialists beyond a footprint of 100 people. So you can get 100 people to talk to each other and work together. You can't get 1,000 people to talk together and work together. So this is one fact that we now know about how this did not work well. The second thing the Ukrainians will say is that the Western knowledge about how to do combined arms warfare is not ready for this battlefield. Okay, they say there are two key differences. Difference number one, the Ukrainian side does not have a Western style air force and complete air superiority. If the Americans were fighting this war, first, the United States Air Force would win the air war. They would win complete, unchallenged air superiority. And then from the air, they would destroy every ground-based asset that is visible. They would strafe every trench, and they would make life miserable for 50, 100 kilometers in the backfield. They would destroy every fuel truck. Okay, and then the grunts would go in and do a mopping up operation. The grunts would never do a frontal assault on a fortified structure. But that's what the Ukrainians are being asked to do. So the Ukrainians are saying, like, hey, your knowledge, your training doesn't prepare you for this because you have always gone to war with an overwhelmingly great air force. We have no air force to speak of, meaning we've been able to do air denial. The Soviets, the Russians don't have air superiority either, but we do not have air superiority. The third thing the Ukrainians say is that you have never fought in a battlefield where there are enemy drones up in the sky. So there are so many beautiful interviews with Ukrainian soldiers who have trained, say, in the UK. And in a way, the UK has done a fantastic job of giving them the latest state-of-the-art British training. And the latest state of the art British training has not thought about hostile skies, where the skies are filled with enemy birds who are either carrying information back that is used to guide artillery. That basically there is a forward artillery observer in the sky who's correcting artillery strikes, or just dropping a hand grenade when the moment arises, or sending in a loitering munition, a kamikaze drone. Finally, the Ukrainians are saying that ever since Second World War, actually you guys have never fought a fair fight. Okay, so the entire Western military experience has been frankly against second-rate and third-rate opponents. They've never fought against an equal. Here, the Ukrainians are fighting against an equal. That the Russian economy is about 3 times bigger than the Ukrainian economy. The Russian population is about 3 times bigger than the Ukrainian population. And Russian incompetence is like a 0.33 multiplication factor. So the two sides are roughly equal in battle. The Ukrainians are saying that you have never had the experience of fighting a peer. Now we are doing it. So in many ways, I believe the tables have turned. Today, Ukraine knows more than anybody else in the whole world about how to fight conventional war. Just think about it. Nowhere else in the world is there a capability comparable to Ukraine of fighting conventional war without air superiority, without nuclear weapons, against a tough opponent, and actually learning the military strategy and tactics and doctrine that will work. I think that war is the lab where the next generation of the Western way of war is being forged.
So, three things leading to a question, and the first of them is you mentioned about the UK military did not prepare for birds in the sky watching them. Have you heard of a guy called Peter McIndoe?
No.
So Peter McIndoe was this 23-year-old guy when he decided that as a public experiment, he's going to give birth to a conspiracy theory, and the conspiracy theory was that birds aren't real. That about a few decades ago, the US government basically killed all birds, millions of birds, and replaced them with artificial birds, basically robots, which have surveillance capabilities and surveil on their on civilians. And a number of I'll link to a video where he talks about this. But proof for this: number one, why are birds always sitting on power lines? They are charging.
They need to recharge.
They need to recharge. Well,
Never mind the lack of an earthing.
Now, you've seen many pigeons. Have you ever seen a baby pigeon? It's because only adult pigeons are created in the factories.
factories.
Yeah. Why do birds poop on people? Surveillance device are tracking you, and so on and so forth, right? And even though he made it up, he knows it isn't true, but a lot of people believed it was true. And he would go for 3 years. He maintained the charade. He would go out in go around in a van and give out flyers and all of that. Delightful story. The second point I want to sort of pick up on is you mentioned Capablanca, right? When you spoke of combined arms warfare, Jose Raul Capablanca, one of the great players of the early 20th century, chess players of the earliest 20th century, was a positional master. So he would not do the kind of thing that the Americans would have wanted, which is a hardcore strike where you just break through everything, coordinates, you win it quickly. That's more like Mikhail Tal, right? That is Tal's approach.
No, I'm thinking once the Capablanca combination is sprung, it is cold, cruel, and perfect.
But Capablanca played a lot like Karpov in the sense that positional master, you're preparing for something 40 moves ahead, and everything is coordinated. And of course, if a tactical chance presents itself, you'll take it. But if your enemy is strong and there are no gaps, you don't unnecessarily try too hard to attack. You just keep positioning yourself and you wait for the end game. And it strikes me that what the Americans wanted was a sort of a Tal or a Fisher kind of, hardcore strike where you're sacrificing this, you're sacrificing that, you're getting through. But what the Ukrainians are doing is this attritional war where they are sort of, everything is they are waiting, they've mapped everything out, they are coordinated, but they're playing within the limitations. And obviously I'm simplifying because Tal was a great positional player and Capablanca could do tactics when required, but broadly. The other interesting thing I think of here is that, one of Putin's favorite sport is judo. And the whole idea of judo is it's not the strong guy who wins. it's a patient, nimble guy who maneuvers the spaces between the bodies, who manages to win in the end. And it seems that over here, it is Ukraine that is winning the battle of judo versus against Russia, which I find delightful. For the third, I want to quote from this great piece in the Financial Times, which you sent me, where they describe exactly the kind of attritional warfare which Ukraine is engaged in, where they write. This has become a war of tree lines, with shifts in the line often counted in hundreds of meters. Artillery fire and drones dominate the battlefield, as small groups of infantry advance through dense minefields, field by field, tree line by tree line. Progress has been fitful and slower than expected. However, Ukraine's recent gains illustrate that it has worn down Russian defenses over time, leveraging an advantage in fires and long range precision weapons to steadily press Russian forces back from their defensive positions. That said, Ukraine will need to both break through Russian lines and exploit that success to reach its objectives. Much could be decided in the coming weeks. Top quote. And I guess the skeptical question being raised here is ki fine. You know, the way the big armies, US and Russia, would do it back in the day, or still think of doing it today, is there's one massive breakthrough and you overwhelm the opponent. What Ukraine is having to do by necessity and the changing nature of war is you can no longer have 50 tanks go together. You'll immediately be spotted and, taken out. But all of these small little attacks, you know, there is also the danger that you keep attacking, but the enemy has, you know, they just have to last longer than you. And we often speak of chess, and we just spoke of judo, but in poker, for example, you might get into a situation where you're in a game and you've got a limited amount of money, and you've got somebody with a massive stack who is just attacking you, attacking you, attacking you, and you keep going all in against him with the better hand. Let's say you'll win a fair number of times, but at some point you're going to go bankrupt because the resources are inexhaustible. And there is a sense that Russia is so much bigger. Their resources are effectively inexhaustible in the sense they can keep putting men into battle. How true is that? Are economic sanctions hurting them? There was a talk that they've reached out to North Korea because they're running out of artillery shells. How does that equation work out?
There are so many angles to go in. Let me try to be disciplined and not make this into a 5-hour conversation. So first, the American way of war was designed around American strength, both around manufacturing and around population. Everybody knows about America as the arsenal of democracy. I just want to show 2-3 sentences that have just endlessly stuck in my mind about how America worked in this war, in the Second World War. All the way till 1941, the giant was slumbering. Okay, after 1941, the giant was swung into action to start producing. For example, to start producing tanks. Okay, and what most people don't think about is that by early 1944, tank production in America was stopped. That's it. 42, 43. That's all. They started from scratch. They built the world's biggest factories to make tanks. They made like 100,000 tanks. And then the field commanders were saying, we're sick of this. We don't want any more tanks. And they started shutting down factories by 1944 at the start. Okay, that is American economic might. It's at a different level altogether compared with anybody else. And also they had an edge in the people, in the population. So they built a way of war around that. And a critical factor in this is how much are you willing to accept the loss of people? Okay. In contrast, Churchill and the UK was always very conscious that they don't have much of a population, so they can't lose a lot of people. So all through the Second World War, there were disagreements and differences on how large can the losses be? How many people can you have getting killed in the process? And I'm being unsentimental about it. Of course, every death is a tragedy. But when you're a small country, it's very different compared to when you're a big country. And so the Americans were in a rush to do Operation Torch in North Africa, to go land at Sicily and on the beaches of Normandy. And Churchill was always the one holding back, saying, we got to do it right. We got to do it right. That be ready for that punch, that it will work. And let's not go get mauled and just lose a lot of people for almost nothing. And the Americans had to be held back consistently. And I think history will judge Churchill very kindly for having had a lot of those strategic calls correctly. Okay, I want to tell a similar second story. After Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the German Wehrmacht was advancing on a very long battlefront in Russia, in the USSR. So there was Army Group North headed towards St. Petersburg. There was Army Group Center headed towards Moscow. There was Army Group South headed later, a little late. They were confused about it, but headed towards Stalingrad and ultimately the oil fields of Baku. There was an overstretch going on. It was a very long front. One of the important strategic choices that Stalin had to make was, do you concentrate your forces? Do you amass your forces? Do you concentrate your forces and strike at one place and score an operational breakthrough and exploit behind? Okay, so great question. How do you do it? Do you fight at many places? Do you fight at one? Stalin, like Lenin and Trotsky, was actually one of the sophisticated intellectuals of the Second World War. And he had this strategic sense that the USSR had a bigger population than Germany. And once the USSR was backed by American manufacturing, they were basically going to outproduce Germany. Okay, there was remarkable levels of German naivete about understanding American economic might, which the communists did not suffer from. The communists correctly understood how war is all economics and it's about production, and they understood the American giant. And Stalin knew that the American giant is on his side, both in terms of teaching Soviet Russia how to produce and in terms of delivering supplies to Soviet Russia. So Stalin made the remarkable call, we will not concentrate. So at every place, Army Group North, the German Army Group North at St. Petersburg, the German Army Group Center at Moscow, the German Army Group South, all the way to Stalingrad, at every place along the way, counterattacks were going on. Why? Because that was his way of wearing down the German human beings and the industrial capacity. And in hindsight, we know he was right. Because Germany just did not have enough resource to spray everywhere. Why did they lose the Battle of Stalingrad? Because they were too occupied doing many other things. You can't predict where it will break, but it'll break somewhere. I think that's the intuition around which we should now think about the words war of maneuver and attritional warfare. I think many people have jumped to the wrong interpretation around the words attritional warfare. You kind of think of a stalemate of First World War, 1914, 1915, 1916, a little bit of 1917. Okay. What I think we should understand is that attritional warfare is today Soviet-style deep operations warfare. It is Ukraine going after the Russian logistics. Okay, day after day, they are operating in the backfield, armed with NATO intelligence, armed with standoff weapons, with partisans operating behind enemy lines, with standoff munitions like the Storm Shadow and the HIMARS missiles, day after day, destroying ammunition dumps, destroying command and control centers, and causing havoc in the Russian backfield that every day chokes the supply of fuel and ammunition and food to the Russian troops, and the ability of evacuating wounded soldiers and creating normal rotation routines where soldiers need to be rotated for R&R. Otherwise, the mine shuts down. After about 6 months of fighting, the mine can't handle it anymore. And so, yes, today it sounds like attritional warfare, but I feel an important intuition is that this is putting the Russian army to the test. By and large, Russian offensive operations have ended. There's a little bit near Kupiansk, but frankly, it's not much. By and large, what's going on is the Russians are pushing at Bakhmut, in the region of Bakhmut. And that is causing a lot of Russian force diversion to Bakhmut. I want to psychoanalyze this. This is a bit like Stalingrad. Okay, why did Stalingrad turn into the mess that it did? Because of the name Stalin. Okay, it suddenly turned into a symbol for both sides. Hitler became extra eager to take Stalingrad as a symbol of toppling Stalin's city, and the Russians became extra eager to prove him wrong. So it turned into an disproportionate force mobilization on both sides. Bakhmut is important because Bakhmut was conquered by Wagner. And the Ukrainian resistance at Bakhmut inflicted such losses upon Wagner that it effectively created a rift between Wagner and the Russian MOD. So, in a way, I feel they did a great job. That they did a fighting retreat in a dinky town of 70,000 people, where in a simplistic way of war, it would have been like, look, you're going to lose, why not just retreat? Retreat to where? What will you defend next? Cities are where you do the defense. It was a city of 70,000 people. By and large, Ukraine lost. But in the process of losing, they inflicted so much damage upon Wagner that it triggered off the mutiny by Wagner and it knocked out one important fighting formation on the Russian side. So I say, that worked very well. It was a very good idea. Okay, now consider the predicament of Wagner. It would be a PR disaster for Wagner. Sorry, it would be a PR disaster for the MOD if they lose Bakhmut. Right? Because now all the Wagnerites in in Russia will say that, see the great Prigozhin and Utkin, the martyrs of a plane crash, they conquered Bakhmut. And once these jelly-livered bureaucrats of the MOD took charge, they were not able to hold that ground. So MOD is desperate. They got to hold Bakhmut. Great. Ukraine will use this to the hilt. They will put pressure at Bakhmut, knowing that MOD can't afford to make a mistake. And MOD will disproportionately allocate resources there. And just keep chipping away, fighting for disproportionate losses. So you've always got to count the exchange rate. How many tanks get killed? How many tanks get killed? How many people get killed? How many people get killed? And so on. So the Ukrainians have to do the math about the expected cost of every decision. Tactics and strategy have to be chosen so that there's a disproportionate expected loss being imposed on the other side. And you got to keep counting every day that are we on track on the run rate? Right? Sounds familiar? And that's what the Ukrainians are doing near Bakhmut. So it locks up a significant Russian force there. Okay. Similarly, let's think about the dagger thrust down through Zaporizhia towards the sea. Yes, they've only crossed 5 kilometers out of 60. They've blocked up a big chunk of Russian forces there. The Russians have built phenomenal fortified lines of protection. For everybody who's curious about this, go back and read the Battle of Kursk from the Second World War. What Russia has done here is basically out of that Soviet playbook, where 7 lines of fortification were built, and when the German attack came, they smashed through 5 of them and ran out of juice. The Ukrainians so far have smashed through maybe 1.5 lines. There are a total of 3 or 4 lines, and they are not done yet. There are difficult lines of fortifications yet to go through. So every day there is a very tough war going on the Russian side, where their logistics is being attacked, their people are being attacked, and you never know where something breaks. And it is when something breaks that the attacking side, namely Ukraine, has to have enough spare capacity to then throw force into the fight and do an exploitation. So the fact that there's attritional warfare today doesn't mean that you are in a 1914 stalemate. It means you're in an attritional war today. But every attritional war can be a prelude to one side breaking. And we are about to discover, will the Russian side break? We don't know. So if you look back at the great Ukrainian gains in Kherson and the great Ukrainian gains in Kharkiv, they also look like attritional warfare for some time. For some time, it's just like you're attacking every day and nothing is happening. But under the hood, there was a lot going on. The Russians lost their logistics capability to support Kherson. And then one fine day, they ran away from Kherson. And the Ukrainians conquered their entire province without a fight. And in that process, they left an undefended chunk up in Kharkiv. And the Ukrainians had spare resources to go launch an attack there and grab another 10,000-15,000 square kilometers. That is the nature of this kind of modern war, that it will look attritional for some time. It may look attritional for months. But that doesn't mean you're stuck as in 1914. It means you are in a great test of wills and economics, and we'll see how it goes. It ain't done. And I want to make one last final proposition here. Why did we think at the outset that what was the most wise and optimal strategy for Ukraine was to do a dagger thrust down through Zaporizhia to the Sea of Azov? Because we thought this is the way that Ukraine will disrupt Russian logistics. Why? Because that 60 kilometers was not a feasible range for the HIMARS rockets, which had a effective range of about 30 kilometers. So there is that M14 highway. Look closely at the map. There is the M14 highway is the critical supply line running through Zaporizhia. It was not possible to safely place HIMARS trucks and hit the M14 highway pre-counteroffensive. I am looking at the map every day and I'm seeing two things. One, I'm seeing HIMARS trucks going closer and closer to being within range of the M14 highway and of every piece of logistics in Zaporizhia. And the second, I'm seeing Ukraine creeping up to better and better standoff weapons. They've already got Storm Shadow, others are coming. So, in a way, I think the objectives, the strategic objectives of every armchair military thinker of the winter of 2022 are coming closer to being met, even without Ukrainian soldiers reaching the Sea of Azov. They've got to get close enough for their standoff weapons to disrupt Russian logistics. And that's not as hard as it seems. Now, we're coming close to winter. We're already in September. Everybody watching this war now knows beautiful Ukrainian words. There is the word raputista, which stands for the mud season, where in autumn and in spring, a lot of the land goes to mud. Well, that doesn't happen as much in the south. The south is a bit warmer than the north. Everybody thinks we're already in September, there will be no fighting days within a week or 10 days. And I say, are you thinking Kiev or are you thinking Melitopol? Because they are hundreds of kilometers apart. And also when you get closer to the sea has a calming effect on the weather. So there are some surprises in store for how this story works out. We should not assume that there is the same Raputista in September, October. We should not assume that the fighting stops in winter. Every piece of the logistics story I tell about the difficulties of the Russian economy in supporting such a project will be amplified in winter, because winter requires more fuel and more materials and more difficulty and greater difficulties of concealment compared to fighting in summer. So it could well be that the war will continue into winter. And we should not have this preconception that, oh, the counteroffensive has failed. They've only made 5 kilometers or 7 kilometers headway into Zaporizhia, and we're almost towards the mud season.
So, now that you've put Capablanca in my head, I can't get him out of there. And everything that you describe about the way Ukraine is fighting the war sounds just like that. Or even in one aspect, Magnus Carlsen, like Gary Kasparov once gave Carlsen what I think is the ultimate compliment, where he said he's a combination of Fischer and Karpov. And Fischer, of course, we all know, great conceptual clarity, a great attacking player. Karpov, the positional genius. And what Carlsen is particularly known for is attritional play in the end game, where there will be a completely equal position, but he'll play 20 moves, 30 moves, 40 moves. He'll just go on and on until something will break. And you can't predict what will break when, but something will break. And in fact, in the World Championship match he won against Nepomniachtchi, the pivotal game was like that. At one point, Nepo was winning. But in the end, Carlsen just pushed and pushed and pushed, and Nepo collapsed. And the interesting thing is, like you mentioned, Bakhmut. And the thing is that before it happened, nobody would have known that, we'll suffer losses, we'll broadly lose, but Wagner will collapse because of it. Correct. You could not have said that in advance. You can never say in advance what is going to break where, but you have to just keep pinging away and something or the other will break.
So there are a couple of scenarios about how this goes. Maybe this year the Ukrainians only make 5, 10, 15 kilometers of progress. What is going to happen next? I think the war just goes on. Okay, there is no way the West walks away from this war. There is no way Ukraine walks away from this war. They'll just go on. If you can get 5, 10 kilometers every few months of fighting, that's okay. Because 60 kilometers to cut to the Sea of Azov, maybe it'll happen next year. Okay, and then the entire Kherson and Zaporizhia and Crimea collapses are then very likely. So that is one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that this year we will get an interesting collapse, and maybe historians will write that Zaporizhia was a fixing operation and the breakthrough and exploitation came at Bakhmut. Or maybe we'll be saying that Bakhmut was a fixing operation holding up a whole bunch of resource and the breakthrough came in Zaporizhia. You can't tell ahead of time how it's going to go.
And I want to, to bring sort of this Ukraine story to a close for this episode. Though who knows, we'll probably have future episodes on it. The way developments happen, I want to ask about how it could possibly end. Like when you think of great historical wars of the past, you hear of how there is a decisive battle somewhere or the other, and the game is over. And even in World War II, you needed actual such radical action to make Germany and Japan kind of give it up. And in modern times, that is something that's become much harder. Where is a decisive battle? What is a breakthrough which will make the enemy stop? Especially if it is an enemy like Russia. Even if Putin goes, can his successor eventually suffer the losing of face that would happen in front of the nationalist elements within the country? So tell me a little bit about the end game. And I'm also intrigued by this great quote I read that militaries win battles, economies win wars. How do we look at that? Like on the one hand, Ukraine is a war economy, it cannot be doing so well, etc., etc. And at the same time, Russia is facing severe sanctions and so on and so forth. So how do you see all of these playing out? What is a best case and a worst case scenario? And when I say best, obviously we are both on the side of liberal democracy and the values we stand for. So
Yeah.
obviously we mean it for Ukraine, and on the other side is the Russian state.
Ukraine is not the war economy to think about. All the advanced economies of the world are working for Ukraine. So the industrial capacity behind Ukraine is essentially infinite. South Korea is the most important maker of artillery shells going to Ukraine, okay, and so on. So all over the advanced economies, a vast military industrial complex is being cranked up into production, and Russia is hilariously outmatched. It's almost laughable, the idea that defense production in Russia and North Korea can keep pace with all the advanced economies of the world working together. So it is slow, it is fumbling, it is incompetent. Various countries amongst the advanced economies are moving at different speeds in getting their act together. But I consider it a bit inexorable that once you start thinking that wars are won by economies and not by militaries, then it's clear as day. Russia is a Spain sized GDP. It is Saudi Arabia with nukes. It's not a serious economy. And the rate of consumption of ammo and defense equipment in this war is just beyond any practical production capabilities inside Russia. A simple thumb rule is that Russia is losing about 1,000 tanks a year and making about 200. So there is no way that they can keep going at this rate. They will double the tank production, it goes from 200 to 400. And Western sanctions interfere with their ability to increase production of munitions. So, at a strategic scale, Russia is hilariously outmatched. The advanced economies of the world put together, which is like Europe, America, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, okay, these are the overwhelming economic force of the world. And when they get to producing, there is nothing remotely in comparison. So the strategic picture is very much in favor of Ukraine. And that is part of Ukrainian strategic thinking that let's not burn too many people. Okay, because Ukraine stands alone in having people dying. And so if you're going to play a long war, you don't want too many people to die. You can waste equipment because the West will produce infinite equipment. Okay, South Korean factories and Japanese factories will produce infinite equipment. So there's no shortage of equipment. But it's good to be frugal about losing people. Turning to the Russian side, there's a fascinating fact that has emerged in the last few days. Russia makes a lot of noise about facing NATO as an enemy. This is just propaganda. There is no depth to that proposition at all. NATO is a defensive alliance. It works out that the military force on the Finnish border, Finland is now a NATO member. The Russian force on the Finnish border is 1/5 of what it traditionally was. So when Finland was the subject of Finlandization and not a NATO member, Russia had 100 units on the Russia-Finland border. Now Finland is a NATO member and Russia has 20 units on the Finland border. What this says is Russia does not have the resource to keep going on all the things that it wants to do, and its entire military resource is being plunged into the war in Ukraine. And therefore, you think of this on a strategic scale. If month after month you keep losing a lot of people and a lot of equipment, then this thing starts falling apart. It's just physically impossible. So just like Ukrainians have problems with training, the Russians have an even bigger problem with training. They're not getting British quality combined arms training. They're getting conscripted blokes being sent into the battle after having fired 10 rounds with infantry gun. So there is no great capability on the Russian side either. The test of all this optimistic view in the eyes of the Ukrainians is that day after day, some pieces of the Russian story are cracking. Okay, so around Bakhmut, you see one Russian brigade being wiped out, 5-10 kilometers of gain. Around Zaporizhia, you see one brigade being wiped out, 2 kilometers of gain. One by one, their pieces are being knocked out, and it becomes harder to continue. And that is the open question: that will Russia find Stalin levels of resolve in coping with losses or not?
Marvelously heartening. I can, if Gaurav is watching this, he'll be like exceptionally pleased and doubled in his admiration of you. I request all our gentle readers that if you want to dig deeper, just get into our 5-hour episode, which will be linked from the show notes, and much more in depth gyan over there. And now it's time for recommendations.
I want to recommend the book How the War Was Won, Air and Sea Power in the Second World War by Philip Payson. This is a recent book, and it is a whole new set of insights on the role of the grunt on the ground versus the high economic strategy of the Second World War. I've been studying this subject all my life, but I found this was full of new knowledge and new insights. And Amit, what's your recommendation for today?
So I want to recommend this magnificent book that you see here. I will pull it out. I love it so much. Well thumbed, as you can see. Ode to Kirihito by Osamu Tezuka. Right now, Tezuka is also known as both the father of manga and the godfather of manga. So father and godfather at the same time. But one of the legendary figures people in India may be familiar with is Buddha series of graphic novels. Ode to Kirihito is a really dark book, and it kind of comes about partly because of a turn that Tezuka took in his career in the late 1960s, where a young person who admired him greatly, Yoshihiro Tatsumi, pioneered a style that was a reaction against manga. It was called Gekiga, right? And Gekiga consists of really dark, urban stories which look at sort of the bleak side of the human condition, moving away from the comic elements and the cheery elements that are there in some manga. So and Tezuka was very taken by that, championed this new form, and circa 1970 wrote this magnificent book Ode to Kirihito, which is a sort of a medical thriller. It is about a doctor who goes to this particular remote area, and he finds that there is a disease that is spreading there, and it is contagious, where basically people are turning into dog-like creatures, and eventually they are dying. And it's just like a bizarre thing that is happening, and he tries to travel the world to look for a cure and catches it himself. And it's a great leap. I mean talking about the plot reveals nothing of the power of the book. It's a great look at the human condition and at the moral decay that can happen within a human being as circumstances change.
I was reminded of Metamorphosis.
No, this is a different level. It is a journey. It is an odyssey. Metamorphosis is a short story, as indeed it is. This is just a different level, and a book that has to be read. One of the most powerful graphic novels I've ever read. And Tatsumi himself, of this book, wrote, Tezuka was like a god for me. He shocked the manga world with the medical thriller genre, and the work he did it with was Ode to Kirihito, a monumental suspense masterpiece that shows off Tezuka's 2 points of expertise, manga and medicine. This is Tatsumi about him. So Tatsumi, young guy, adores his master, then forms a new genre, and then this master comes and says, I am influenced by what you're doing, let me do some of it. And Tezuka was a really inspiring man that way, in the sense that he was constantly working all his life. And here's a remarkable thing about Tezuka. In 1989, he died of stomach cancer, and while he was at the hospital, he was trying to draw right in his last moments, and the nurse came to take the drawing equipment away, and his last words were, I'm begging you, let me work. right? And I find this so inspiring. Someone who kept working till the end, and even after he died, there's a story about how his daughter opened his drawer at home, and there was a whole bunch of unfinished work out there, and it's just inspiring. And since we have come to Gekiga, I will also recommend two great books by Tatsumi. Tatsumi, 1969, brought out a collection called The Pushman and Other Stories, and a year after that, he got out another great collection called Abandon the Old in Tokyo, which were later reproduced in English by Drawn and Quarterly, which is a Canadian publishing house. And again, a great examples of Gekiga at its best, really dark urban stories. Like one such story in The Pushman and Other Stories is called Bedridden. It's about this factory worker called Fukuda. And Fukuda, once at a factory or something, gets ill or injured and he's bedridden. So he pays a colleague of his a large sum of money, saying that I have a woman I take care of at home and I want you to go and look after her. And this colleague of his goes to his home and he finds that the woman whom he's supposed to look after is basically someone whose limbs were crippled and she's a sex slave. She's only for that purpose out there. And his response is to strangle Fukuda and become the ninth master of this woman. Right, so a really dark story. In Abandon the Old in Tokyo, there's a story called My Beloved Monkey, where he gets off where this guy has a pet monkey. One day he gets off at the wrong train stop and he goes to the zoo, and all these monkeys in this enclosure are kind of giving him a hard time. I think they attack him or something. I don't remember the details, but he goes off. And later, during his work, he loses his arm. And how is he going to take care of his pet monkey? He doesn't know what to do. So he releases it in what he thinks is a natural habitat in that enclosure where all the other monkeys are. And in front of him, his beloved pet monkey is torn to shreds by the other monkeys. And it also ends in a remarkable way, which you kind of have to read. But these are really dark stories that stare into the depths of the human soul. And manga is a great genre, of course, but Gekiga goes to all the places where manga really doesn't go. So that's my recommendation.
So we're at the end of this episode. We hope you have been amused and you have found more interesting things to read out of all our labors. Please do subscribe and like, but even more important, come be part of these great discussions that are erupting in the comments.